Those stories we are following on this Monday. President Park Geun-hye sticks to being stern about North Korea's provocations, but stays open for talks as well. This as Pyongyang remains unhappy about anti-regime leaflets being flown across the border. Policymakers around the world give out warnings about the slowing global economy at semi-annual IMF meetings. They are worried about asset bubbles that could lead to another global crisis. And a healthcare worker who helped treat an Ebola-infected patient becomes the first person to get the virus on U.S. soil. Stay tuned for these stories and more coming right up. It's 6 in the evening on Monday, October 13th here in Korea. Live from Seoul, I'm Laah Hyun-kyung.
And I'm Daniel Choy. Thank you for joining us. We begin at the nation's top office today. President Park Geun-hye says the government will continue to take a two-track approach when it comes to dealing with North Korea.
That's right. That two-track approach being firmly responding to North Korea's provocations while leaving the option of talks open. Arirang's presidential office correspondent Choi You-sun has our top story.
3 days after North Korea fired machine gun rounds in retaliation of South Korean propaganda leaflets, President Park Geun-hye stressed that the two Koreas need to engage in talks.
전쟁 중에도 대화는 필요하다는 말이 있듯이 한반도 긴장 완화와 평화 정착을 위해서는 대화가 지속되어야 합니다. 고위급 접촉을 남북 관계 개선의 기회로 삼아야 합니다.
Pyongyang's latest hostile act came just days after it took Seoul up on an offer for talks. At our Unification Preparatory Committee's second meeting Monday, the South Korean president said when the two sides meet, they should talk over the possibility of the South lifting sanctions that were imposed after the North torpedoed a South Korean warship in 2010. By referring to the sanctions, a major bone of contention between the two Koreas for the first time since taking office last year, President Park is thought to have placed more weight on settling issues through dialogue. The president, however, took a cautious tone about mending ties with North Korea, saying inter-Korean relations have always been double-sided.
섣부른 판단으로 남북 관계의 환경을 바꾸는 것은 매우 위험한 일입니다. 그렇기 때문에 정부는 앞으로도 도발에는 단호히 대처해 나가되 대화의 문은 항상 열어놓고 평화 정착을 위해 노력해 나갈 것입니다.
As for a campaign to have both Koreas prepare for unification, the president called for a detailed plan to break ground on her envisioned DMZ Peace Park, a charter to instill public will for unification and increase support for the North's humanitarian needs. Choi You-sun, Arirang News.
While the South is holding meetings to prepare for a reunification, North Korea continues to send strong warnings against South Korean activists flying anti-Pyongyang leaflets across the border. The regime warned Seoul to make the right decision or else face the consequences. Our Unification Ministry correspondent Hwang Sung-hee reports.
North Korea has warned it will step up its physical strikes if South Korean activists continue to fly anti-Pyongyang leaflets across the border. In a statement released Sunday, the North said its military attack designed to destroy balloons carrying anti-North leaflets on Friday shows its warnings are not empty words. But Pyongyang did not back out of an agreement to hold a second round of high-level talks.
There is still chance for making a decision. South Korea should acknowledge our sincere efforts to write a new history for improving North-South relations and not pour cold water on the opportunity.
In response, South Korea said Monday that the high-level talks, slated for late this month or early November, should take place as planned, but reiterated it will not interfere with civilian activities.
I believe it is the government's duty to guarantee the freedom of expression unless the law specifies otherwise. At the same time, we must continue efforts to protect our people and property from North Korean threats.
Seoul's defense ministry said Monday that Pyongyang, through their military hotline on Saturday, declared the start of a battle to destroy South Korean balloons carrying the controversial leaflets. Considering that South Korea had warned earlier of strong countermeasures against further provocations, experts say the latest military tensions could put inter-Korean relations back at square one. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
And now on to an issue between South Korea and China. Beijing is demanding answers in the death of a Chinese fisherman at the hands of the Korean Coast Guard last week. Officials here say the use of force was necessary in the face of a threat posed by the captain and his crew. They plan to pursue charges against others on board for illegal fishing and acts of violence. Kim Young-gil has more.
Illegal fishing from Chinese vessels is common in waters off Korea's west coast, and so are clashes between their fishermen and Korea Coast Guard officials. The latest came Friday when a Chinese fishing boat captain was shot dead during a raid. 3 others who were on board had been jailed for acts of violence against the Coast Guard, while 16 other crewmen are being investigated. On Monday, the Korea Coast Guard requested an arrest warrant for the chief engineer of the fishing boat due to the absence of the deceased captain. The 45-year-old chief engineer has been accused of not paying a $112,000 deposit for fishing out of season and not properly equipping the fishing boat with the proper documentation and gear. The death of the Chinese fisherman also triggered the Chinese government to call in Korea's ambassador to China for an emergency meeting last Friday. Chinese Assistant Foreign Minister Liu Jianqiao lodged a protest to Korean ambassador to China Kwon Young-se and asked that Korea conduct a thorough investigation into the case, punish those responsible and take measures to prevent similar incidents from happening again. The Korea Coast Guard maintains that the Chinese fishermen resisted arrest using knives and even tried to strangle the Korean officers who had boarded the vessel. Kwon delivered his condolences to the family of the Chinese skipper and promised to provide regular reports on the progress of the probe. He also defended the raid, calling it a legitimate means of cracking down on illegal fishing. It is the first time that Ambassador Kwon was summoned by the Chinese government since he took his post in June last year. Kim Young-gil, Arirang News.
Clashes between pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong and those who oppose them broke out on Monday. Hundreds of people tried to tear down protest barricades at the main Occupy Central protest site in Admiralty. Dozens of men wearing masks demanded that police clear the roads, accusing demonstrators of damaging their livelihoods. Police were attempting to keep the two groups apart. Elsewhere, authorities are attempting to get the city back to normal. In Mongkok, the police have taken down barricades set up by demonstrators, opening back up 5 lanes to traffic. Hong Kong's chief executive C.Y. Leung said Sunday that the demand for his resignation and the lifting of China's influence in the 2017 chief executive elections have, quote, zero chance of succeeding. A nurse in the U.S. who helped treat a now-deceased Ebola patient, Thomas Eric Duncan, is confirmed to have been infected with the disease. These cases are highlighting the risks healthcare professionals face on the front lines, regardless of where they are in the world. Our Kim Min-ji has this report.
U.S. health officials have confirmed that a healthcare worker in Texas has contracted Ebola, marking the first known transmission of the virus in the U.S. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control announced Sunday local time that preliminary blood tests were positive. The nurse, who was reported to have had a low-grade fever on Friday, had tended to a Liberian man who died of the virus at a Dallas hospital last week. The CDC director warned that more workers could have been exposed to the virus, attributing the nurse's infection to a breach of safety protocol. He said a full investigation would be launched into the matter.
We are evaluating other potential healthcare worker exposures, because if this individual was exposed, which they were, it is possible that other individuals were exposed. We know that this individual did provide care to the index patient on multiple occasions, and that care included extensive contact.
Hospital officials say the worker had been wearing protective gear during treatment, which includes gowns, gloves, masks, and shields. The nurse is said to be in a stable condition. In a statement later in the day, U.S. President Barack Obama urged federal authorities to take immediate additional steps to ensure hospitals and healthcare workers nationwide are prepared to follow protocols should they tend to an Ebola patient. The current Ebola outbreak, the worst of its kind, has killed more than 4,000 people, mostly in West Africa, with over 8,000 infected. But with thousands of Liberian healthcare workers set to go on an indefinite strike late Monday night over a pay dispute, efforts to contain the spread could be put at risk. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
Today in Korea, especially in Seoul, it's almost impossible to walk around the neighborhood without running into a franchised coffee shop.
There's little arguing that there's just too many of them, and naturally customers have started looking for something different and more personal. And that's what our Kwon So-hwa is taking a look into on this week's Industry Insight.
In the 5 minutes I've been walking along this street in Seoul's Gangnam district, I've passed by 20 coffee shops.
A recent survey revealed that Koreans drink coffee more often than they eat rice, in one of the clearest examples yet of Koreans' love for coffee.
Breaking it down, the average Korean adult drinks more than 12 cups of coffee a week. That's almost 2 a day. And coffee imports are on the rise as well. Last year's amount would be the equivalent of nearly 300 cups per person. Korea's coffee market is estimated to be worth more than 6.1 trillion won or 5.7 billion US dollars. The industry got a big boost when Starbucks arrived in Korea back in 1999. Soon after, domestic brands jumped on the bandwagon to compete against foreign franchises, and they rapidly expanded their business too.
Korea's coffee industry is one of the fastest growing in the world. One of the reasons is because Koreans are quick to adapt to new cultures. Also, trying different foods and drinks is a very important cultural activity in our daily lives.
However, with some brands like Cafe Bene edging close to 1,000 stores nationwide, industry observers say the market for branded coffee shops is saturated. Now, an increasing number of consumers are opting for something special that's not on every corner, like at this independent coffee shop.
The coffee tastes more unique than at franchises, and I feel much cozier here. That's why I come here a lot.
In the past, people put more importance on the spatial side of coffee shops, as they looked for a good place to chat, read, or surf the internet. However, these days they are more interested in the actual taste of the coffee they buy. That's why I think more and more coffee shops will adopt specialty coffees, like we do.
Marang Coco's CEO focuses on satisfying the individual needs of his customers. He says that while big franchises have the upper hand when it comes to marketing, it takes them time to develop a new menu, whereas small stores can communicate with customers and get feedback right away. And that's how menu items like Dutch cream beer, popovers, Candy Pop Latte, to name just a few, have been such a hit with their customers. It remains to be seen, though, whether Korean consumers' desire for something unique and more delicious is enough to break the steady dominance of the big-name players. Kwon So-hwa, Arirang News.
Face a one-day entry ban. 77.
Digging deeper, getting to the bottom of stories that impact your life. Talking with you on air and online. Connecting you with experts on the world's most pressing issues. News and current affairs at its best. With Laah Hyun-kyung and Daniel Choy.
Arirang News.
Arirang News.
Arirang News.
On Early Edition at 6.
The International Monetary Fund is calling for aggressive measures to keep the global economy from falling into a recession. Many policymakers and economists around the world are worried about inflated asset prices that could stir up another financial shock. Our Song Ji-sun has the details.
At the IMF semi-annual meetings that wrapped up over the weekend, global leaders sounded an alarm about the slowing world economy. On top of this, economists and policymakers, and even some investors, warned that expansionary monetary policies could trigger a global financial crisis. They pointed to inflated asset prices and the increasing debt levels of many countries. Bond markets in the Eurozone are booming, and China's debt is hovering at a record high despite slowing growth. Share prices in the U.S. have also soared in recent months, although there was a sharp fall last week. Still, the European Central Bank is pressuring its member countries to buy government bonds in the Eurozone, which would trigger even more of a global buying frenzy for the bonds. Chief economists and major institutions say central bankers need to be aware of asset bubbles and act accordingly. According to a report by the IMF, asset management firms have increased their purchase of bonds from emerging markets to nearly $2 trillion from $265 billion in the early 2000s. Regulators worry that retail investors will pull their money out at the same time when U.S. interest rates rise, triggering another market convulsion in emerging economies. The Federal Reserve is set to end its current bond buying program this month. Its next step would be raising its near-zero rate, probably in mid-2015. The IMF also called on central banks to be careful when communicating changes in policy in order to avoid financial market shocks. Song Ji-sun, Arirang News.
Korea's National Pension Service is planning to increase its exposure to the market substantially starting next year. In a report submitted to the National Assembly today, the organization is said to be planning on upping investments in domestic shares next year to have investments surpass the 100 trillion won mark, or roughly $93 billion US. That's up 30% from this year and nearly double from 5 years ago. The agency, however, will cut its bond purchases by 15% next year compared to this year and slash real estate and infrastructure investment by an average of 18%. In other news, the fact that the number of Chinese visitors to Korea continues to grow is not changing, but the way they spend their time in Korea seemingly is. Despite a record-breaking 164,000 visitors over the week-long National Day holiday this year, customer transaction figures show the average Chinese tourist spent less money during their stay compared to the past. This is being attributed to a change in shopping trends. Chinese tourists bought fewer luxury brand accessories than last year, but more cosmetics and food items. A shift was also seen in their favorite destinations. Seoul's main shopping district of Myeongdong saw fewer visitors compared to last year, while Dongdaemun saw an increase boosted by the First Lady of China, Peng Liyuan, who visited the shopping area earlier this year.
Well, shopping is certainly one motivation for people to land jobs. It's that time of the year when job seekers in Korea get busy trying to find and land their dream jobs. Arguably the most sought-after position is a seat at Korea's largest conglomerate, Samsung. Some 100,000 applicants tried to pass through the first narrow gate yesterday. Our Son Jung-in has the story.
It's early on a Sunday morning and hundreds of job seekers look nervous as they get ready to take the Samsung aptitude test, the company's current employment system. The test is the first gateway they need to pass through in order to land a job at the company.
I prepared for the test by reading SSAT-related books that give you examples of all the questions that are likely to come up.
Some 100,000 hopefuls apply for jobs at Samsung Group and its subsidiaries in the second half of this year for around 4,000 vacancies. The test was held in 82 regions, including 3 test venues abroad.
I majored in liberal arts and I'm poor at science, so I focused more on the subject, but surprisingly, there were more questions on world history and literature, so I was a little overwhelmed.
Korean conglomerates have started to put more emphasis on understanding Korean history and liberal arts when recruiting applicants. They realized that English test scores and school grades were not enough to find applicants with creative minds. LG Group included questions on Chinese characters in their employment test, while SK, GS, and POSCO added more history-related questions. However, critics say it's just an additional source of stress for job seekers already faced with the daunting challenge of finding a good job in the country. 손정인, Arirang News.
An overwhelming majority of Korean university students are apparently very much underwhelmed by the politicians that represent them. In a survey conducted by a local newspaper on nearly 2,000 college students this August and September, 85% of respondents said politicians were the most unreliable group in Korean society. Journalists, unfortunately, were next on the list at around 7%, followed by soldiers and businessmen at about 2% each. As for the most reliable segment of the population, more than 15% of respondents pointed to themselves, university students, and the nonprofits and farmers. Regarding the most pressing issue in Korea, more than a quarter of those surveyed said it was corruption, followed by the disparity between the rich and the poor.
Well, on a brighter note, autumn is when people usually and easily become sentimental and nostalgic, and there's a reason why I say this.
Right, there's a few musical acts which decided to tap into that sentiment this year with comeback albums and performances.
Our Im Yoon-hee introduces us to some of those artists.
The Classic, a hit duo from the 90s, released a teaser last month hinting at a new album. And after much anticipation, it's finally here. It's been a decade since the beloved pair has released anything new, and their reappearance is bringing back nostalgic memories.
It's about that reminiscent feeling of being an adult and going back to find that childhood neighborhood you grew up in.
They first debuted in 1994, and although they had many hits themselves, some of their songs were kept alive on the charts after being remade by younger artists.
Many of my younger peers kept singing my songs, which encouraged me while I was creating music. So now I feel like I have this new energy.
Another romantic voice back in the game is singer-songwriter Kim Dong-ryul, who has returned to woo his audiences once again with a new album.
I'm a huge fan of Kim Dong-ryul. It's been a while since I've heard new music from him, so this is a real treat.
And other stars from the 90s making comebacks are Yoo Hee-yeol, who became an iconic one-man band with Toy, and singer-songwriter Yoon Sang, who recently released a new single with plans for an album in the near future.
The stars from the 90s had a strong fan base, and now popular shows these days often audition with hit songs from the 90s, so the younger generation is staying in contact.
These 90s heartthrobs know that their era may have passed, but they've still got it in them, and their loyal fans eagerly awaiting a return to the stage. Im Yoon-hee, Arirang News.
Now the weather, we turn to our Michelle Park at the Weather Center for the updates.
Well, Michelle, some parts of the country felt the effects of Typhoon Vangfang today. How are things looking right now?
Well, it's currently raining at a rate about 10 millimeters per hour in the southern and east coastal regions. The rain should clear up by this evening, but until then, those areas can expect between 10 and 30 millimeters to fall. Now, along with this rain, those regions will have typhoon warnings ahead, strong winds alert, and high wave advisories in effect, so exercise caution if you're near Korea's coast. Now, the weather will clear up tomorrow. Expect a nice sunny day all across the nation. However, the temperatures are expected to remain low, maybe even lower than today, barely making into the 20s and while the lows will dip into the low teens for some regions. Now, going over to our temperature readings for tomorrow. Seoul will start off the Tuesday morning at 9 before reaching up to 20 in the afternoon. Meanwhile, the southern cities such as Daegu and Busan will make it into the 20s as well. Now going over to other regions, Jeju Island makes it over to 19, while Dokdo drops over to 14, while Mankungang will be tabbed higher at 16 degrees. Well, that's all for now. I'm Michelle Park, and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you for that. That's all we have for you at this hour. Thank you for staying with us. To our viewers in different time zones, have a wonderful day. This has been Daniel Choy.
And I'm Laah Hyun-kyung, wishing our viewers in Korea a great rest of the evening. Daniel and I will be back same time tomorrow.